So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eivind Engebretsen. I'm a professor at the University of Oslo, and I'm very happy to be invited to speak at this extremely interesting course. So thank you, Sarah and team, for organizing this and for inviting me. I'm going to talk about unimplementability of the SDGs, and will come back to what that is. And my talk is inspired partly by the work that I'm doing at the University of Oslo, where I'm leading a Center for Sustainable Healthcare Education, which is a center of excellence that is funded by the Norwegian government. And in this center, we aim to encourage critical thinking among health care workers or future healthcare workers about the SDGs and sustainability. And the other source of inspiration is a grant proposal that I have submitted to the European Commission in collaboration with Trish Greenhouse. And where we try to unpack this concept of unimplementability and use this as a kind of a concept or an approach in order to rethink the implementation of the SDGs on a global level. So I will share a few slides. Here we go. There we are. So unimplementability of the Sustainable Development Goals. And here's the plan for my short talk here today. First, I will talk about the emergence of the Sustainable Development Goals and a little bit about their at least intentional impact on health, and also their underpinning principles, which I think are very good in intention. Then I will switch to the question of politics and the politics of sustainability and the politics of the Sustainable Development Goals, which I will argue is often underestimated. Then I will try to unpack this concept of unimplementability and show what we mean by it and how it might be relevant in order to discuss the SDGs. And I will use the case of COVAX and the TRIPS, the so-called TRIPS agreement about the lifting of patents during COVID in order to illustrate my more kind of general argument. And then I will end by a call for a more critical approach to sustainability studies, which I think is important. Okay, so the Sustainable Development Goals, as you all know, these global goals were adopted by the United Nations in 2015. And they are extremely ambitious. They serve as the foundation for the so-called Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development, and they aim to reduce social and economic disparities, to eradicate poverty, while also enhancing nutrition, health and well-being, and education for all. And they consist of 17 goals, as you can see here, and 169 targets. And as you might know, the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, they replace the previous global goals, the so-called Millennium Development Goals. And they are also distinct from the MDGs in some important ways. First of all, they apply to all countries. They do not distinguish between developing and developed countries. According to the SDGs and the SDG agenda, all countries are developing countries in the sense that they are in need of a shift towards sustainable development. And they also in a sense, are different from the MDGs by, at least on an intentional level, wanting to address the root causes of global challenges, such as poverty, inequity, climate change, and ill health. They do not only want to address the symptoms, but the root causes. And that means that they take on a holistic approach to these various challenges that the goals describe. The SDGs are based on the assumption that poverty, for instance, cannot be addressed in isolation. It must be linked to ill health. It must be linked to climate. It must be linked to inequity, and so on and so forth. So the SDGs insist that all the global goals are fundamentally interlinked and can only be addressed together. And these are, I think, very good thoughts. I'm not against the SDGs, or I'm not against sustainable development, not at all. I'm running a center for sustainable development in health. So it would be odd to be against it. But as everything else which society considered as inherently good, such as evidence or empowerment or quality, democracy, it needs to be scrutinized, and it needs to be we need to attend to it in a critical manner, and that is the aim of this talk. And so these ideas are in principle good, and they are also at least again on an intentional level introduced into the field of health and healthcare in different ways. And this is on the left side here, you can see a definition of sustainable health that we use at the University of Oslo. So providing high quality healthcare for all without compromising the ability of the next generation to meet their own needs. And this this definition is paraphrasing the original definition of sustainable development, which was introduced by our former Prime Minister in Norway, Gro Harlem Brundtland, in the so-called Brundtland Report, Our Common Future, from 1987. And that was actually the report that first coined the concept of sustainable development. And this report says that sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So it is this radical anticipatory approach which is characteristic to sustainable development, and also, we argue, to sustainable health, that we need to address current health challenges using the future consequences, future implications, the need of future generations as a yardstick. And this also requires not only an anticipatory gaze, but it also requires a systems lens. We need to take on a whole of society approach to how health is can be improved. And the SDGs, and I think this is important, cannot be considered as a list of separate goals, as I said, but they also reflect some important key principles that underpin all the SDGs, and that needs to be taken into account when we talk about sustainable development in a health setting, but also in any other settings, and when we talk about implementing the SDGs. So it is about, as I said, a systems approach. It is about, when addressing health issues, you need to take both ecological, economic, and social dimensions of sustainable development into account. The 2030 Agenda insists that these three dimensions of sustainability, ecological, economic, and social, are closely interlinked and must always be considered together. So systems approach, but also, as I already said, anticipatory approach. And that's again the core of the Brundtland Commission definition, that we cannot address current challenges and issues without looking at the need of the future, of future populations. So and that also goes for health. So we need to have a careful analysis and look at future consequences of our current actions and decisions. And then the third kind of principle, which is equity. And maybe the most used expression throughout the Agenda 2030 is leaving no one behind. That sustainable development is development that leaves no one behind. That it's a development for all. And I think that's also extremely important, again, on an intentional level. And it's very easy to agree with these principles. And I think these are good principles and important principles that we need to work towards realizing. But the question is how? How can we fulfill these goals and principles? A few more words about the implication of these intentions on health and healthcare, because at least again, on an intentional level, this might, or these principles might change how we think about health. So it's, first of all, it represents a shift from a focus on treatment and symptoms and consequences of ill health to prevention, to promotion, health promotion, and also health preparedness writ large, which reflects this future-oriented approach to health challenges. And the same goes for also overdiagnosis and overtreatment. The fact that we need to consider future consequences of our current health decisions means that we must take phenomena such as overdiagnosis and overtreatment and antimicrobial resistance and that kind of challenges into account, which requires us to choose wisely, which I suppose that you know is an international kind of movement addressing the problem of overtreatment and overdiagnosis in health. And then we have the more social aspect of sustainability, which reflects in the need for universal health coverage, which is the equity approach that comes in, and also the question of social determinants. So it's not about looking at the effects only, but it's about looking at the root causes, and that ill health is not only an individual problem, but it's a societal matter. It is something that reflects dysfunctions in our society, and which an ill health is fundamentally socially determined. And then, of course, the link between health and climate. So the turn towards lower carbon footprint and energy efficient healthcare, and also the new notions of planetary health, which in a sense expands global health to not only consider the effects on humanity, but also the link between the health of humanity and the health of our planet. And linked to this also the concept of One Health, which sees or insists that the health of the human health must be considered in relation to animal health and also the health of the planet. So these are some of the ideas that the Sustainable Development Goals have triggered within the field of health. But, and now I come to the main message of this talk, why do these ideas fail to a large extent? And I think it's a fact that the SDGs, we are now halfway to 2030, and most of the SDGs are failing. And this is an article from Nature Sustainability, which examines the implementation of the SDGs from three perspectives. So first, from a discursive perspective, to what extent do people talk about the SDGs? A normative perspective, to which extent does the SDGs reflect in laws and regulations, and then an institutional perspective, to what extent have actual programs been implemented. And their conclusion, which is actually quite disturbing, is that in most cases, implementation of the SDGs has been limited to talk, to a discursive perspective. So actions at a deeper level has been very, very limited. And we need to relate this to the question of politics and the sustainable development as a political project. And I think the political side of the SDGs, and more specifically the SDG implementation, which I will come back to, is often underestimated. Because there is something inherently political in the whole idea of a universal agenda. It's something political, but it's also something apolitical in the sense, because the agenda tends to, by using the concept of universal and by insisting on its universal character, the SDGs tend to portray humankind as a single political group with a single political project. And this is, of course, a political move, but so it's about being apolitical in a political way. And it is political by marginalizing political differences. It characterizes the whole as the world as speaking with one single voice. So this has led Teleria and Garcia Arias to describe the Agenda 2030 as a depoliticizing political device that makes an inherently political issue look not political. And one aspect of this politics of the Sustainable Development Goals is that it blurs the agenda, or the goals blurs the distinction between a promise and an obligation. We have written about this in a short comment in The Lancet a few years ago. So here we do a close reading of the Agenda 2030, and we identify a kind of conflict in the text between a promise and an obligation. On the one hand, there is, by analyzing the we the people, the voice that is speaking in the agenda. So there is on the one hand, there is the we the people who makes a promise. We pledge, we, the nations of the United Nations, pledge that no one will be left behind. This is a promise on behalf of one we. But then this promise shall be fulfilled or realized through an obligation, where a new we and an expanded we comes in that goes beyond the we of the national leaders making the promise. Now it is suddenly for all of us to ensure that the journey is successful. It involves governments as well as parliaments, the United Nations system, and other international institutions, local authorities, indigenous peoples, civil society, business, and the private sector, the scientific and academic community, and all people. So the national leaders making a promise are making this promise on behalf of a much larger we, which is all people. And the problem with blurring this kind of distinction between a promise and an obligation is also that the mechanism of accountability becomes very unclear. Because when everyone is responsible, no one is responsible. So again, it's a political move. I don't know if you recognize this man, Paul Farmer. He is one of the most important figures within global health in the last 50 years. He unfortunately he died a year or two ago. And I had the pleasure working a little bit with him, and he had some very, very radical thoughts regarding sustainable development and how the concept of sustainable development in global health should be challenged. And he said that sustainable development is not only both a promise and an obligation, but it is both a gift and a weapon as it is used in global health. So he says that on the one hand, sustainable development is a gift. It is development that shall not compromise anyone. Again, the leaving no one behind principle. So it's an expression of a gift in the meaning of global solidarity, leaving no one behind, global equity, global solidarity. But at the same time, as often used in practice, when implemented, sustainable development is used as a weapon. Because medical treatments and technologies, which we take for granted in the global north, are often considered unsustainable in the regions where they are the most needed. So sustainable development becomes a kind of weapon used against the poorer inhabitants of indebted countries. And this is how he frames the problem. So sustainability, the kind of care that we receive, isn't affordable or sustainable for them, the poorer inhabitants of indebted countries. And Paul Farmer, he uses the case of, he wrote about this actually since early 2000, and he used the example of HIV medication, saying that treatments that were taken for granted in the global north were often considered as unsustainable in poorer countries where the need was even more greater, because they lacked capacity in order to use, allegedly, to use these treatment schemes in the right way. And you see, and I'll come back to that, exactly the same argument reflected in the debate about COVAX and COVID-19 vaccines, and the lack of production capacity in global south, the lack of sustainability that is used against the people that needed the vaccines the most. And this is a paper that we wrote with Paul Farmer and a few other colleagues. And actually, we wrote this back in the 2016, so quite soon after the ratification of the SDGs. But here we point to certain paradoxes in the use of sustainability in global health, and also how the concept has changed and been co-opted from, in the beginning, being a kind of urge towards solidarity, to becoming a neoliberal concept arguing for self-assistance. So we try to show here by analyzing OECD documents from three periods, that the interpretation of the concept has evolved from implying enduring assistance to a particular project. So enduring long-lasting solidarity, to denoting self-assistance. And by doing so, sustainability is also transformed for being a goal, an objective of development aid, to becoming a benchmark for assistance. So sustainable development is not something that donors and recipients shall obtain together, but sustainability is a kind of a treat that the recipients shall have before they are worthy of assistance. So what we argue here is also that the new neoliberal concept of sustainability reintroduce a kind of an idea of the worthy needy in global health. So let's turn to the question about implementation, because this is how implementation is often envisioned with regards to the SDGs, and it's also the kind of implementation logic which is laid out in SDG 17, which is about implementation, and also the indicator framework that accompanies the SDGs with a set of metrics. So that there is a global vision for SDGs, and which is defined by the UN, and which has a kind of universal legitimacy, as I talked about, talking for all people, which is then translated into practice, so to speak, through evidence-based interventions. And these evidence-based interventions, often in terms of indicators and metrics, they are also considered to be universally applicable and having kind of universal validity. And then by doing so, these SDGs, or these global visions, are translated into local delivery or local practice. And this is the kind of logic that Trish and I, in different ways, want to challenge. And we want to challenge it by insisting on the fact that this logic is not productive, that it simply doesn't lead to implementation. It leads to the opposite. It leads to unimplementability. And we when we do so, we introduce the concept of unimplementability, and we lean on the medical anthropologist Charles Briggs and his discussion of uncommunicability when we do that. But we, because we insist that implementability, or we argue that implementability as a kind of an assumption, a point of departure, this chain that we looked at, this is how it is supposed to happen. If everything goes right, this is how it is supposed to happen. It reflects an idea of modern, rational, and liberal subjects. And it also, by the same move, it reflects the idea that unimplementability, when it doesn't happen like this, it is a failure. It is the result of actors not being capable of implementing in the right way. And this is also a similar criticism that Paul Farmer had when the HIV medication wasn't implemented as they were supposed to in the global south. It was a failure of the people living there. It was an expression of people not being capable of implementing. So we want to challenge this by saying that we cannot use implementability as a kind of point of departure, because there is something fundamentally problematic with this chain that I showed you. Actually, this chain leads to unimplementability, as we argue, because it is framed in a particular way. Already, I talked about some aspects of this framing in terms of the global voice, marginalizing difference, and so on. It is monitored using inflexible and questionable metrics, such as the SDG indicator framework, which actually leads to failure. And it is enacted in bureaucratic ways that obscure key perspectives and practicalities, and also importantly, ethical questions. And all this leads to unimplementability. So this whole idea of, if you follow this chain and the step, it will lead to implementability, that is mistaken in our view. On the opposite is true. It will lead to unimplementability. But so we need to acknowledge unimplementability. We need to harness unimplementability and to inhabit it productively, rather than taking implementability as a kind of a given point of departure. And this requires that we bring politics back to policy implementation. A major failure of policy implementation in general, and also SDG implementation more specifically, is that it is, again, going back to this chain, considered as a non-political process, and thereby leading to false consensus. So, but we insist that we need to bring politics back into policy implementation, and by fostering productive disagreement. And again, evidence-based interventions, considered universal, which comes with targets and success metrics, again, defined by some on behalf of someone else, they may come into conflict. In practice, they may come into conflict with local realities and leading to implementation failure. And that is not, we don't want to see this as the failure of the people on the ground, which is the kind of hidden assumption behind the chain I showed you. It is the failure of the system. It is the failure of a way of framing implementation as non-political. So we need to bring these discussions, bring these local conflicts and disagreements back into the debate about implementation. And this is where we lead on the Belgian political philosopher Chantal Mouffe and her idea of agonistic pluralism. She argues that if differences, disagreements are surfaced, discussed, and strategically harnessed, they can become a positive force. They can become what she calls agonistic pluralism. And she distinguishes agonistic pluralism or agonism from antagonism. Antagonism is open conflict, like in a war situation, while agonism is productive disagreement within the space of democratic and open debate. So, but if we marginalize agonistic pluralism, it will at some point lead to antagonism and open conflict, she claims. So let's turn to COVAX as a case in point in order to illustrate some of these arguments. As you know, COVAX was a historic now multilateral effort aimed to accelerate the development and manufacture of COVID-19 vaccines and to guarantee, importantly, fair and equitable access to every country in the world. And it came to a close in December in 2023. And this whole setup, this whole scheme was to a large extent a failure. So it's an example of a SDG-inspired project which failed in practice. And why did it fail? Again, we analyze this by approaching it through our lens of unimplementability. We say that unimplementability was built into the framing of COVAX because it was primarily perceived as, or it primarily perceived vaccine equity as an act of philanthropy. I will come back to that. And this approach also shaped, and the unimplementability was strengthened through metrics that tracked vaccine sales to the global south, and by doing so overshadowing other approaches to the problem, other views on progress. And I want to link this to the TRIPS agreement, the so-called TRIPS agreement. In 2020, a few countries from the global south proposed a waiver from certain provisions of the TRIPS agreements, or the World Trade Organization's agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, which is TRIPS. And this waiver would allow low-income countries to produce their own vaccine. So that was what this was about. Should we lift the patents in order to facilitate production, local production of vaccines in the global south? And many countries in the global north, including EU, but also supported by the UK, the US, and Norway, argued against this waiver because they considered the only solution to the lack of vaccines in the global south was global collaboration, as they said, which they interpreted and understood in a specific way. So global collaboration meant a global effort to produce vaccines in high-income countries and then distribute them to the rest of the world. So global collaboration became a concept that excluded local production of vaccine. And the point being that COVAX, global, which was global collaboration, was used as a justification for not expanding vaccine production capabilities in the global south. I think this is quite disturbing, actually, that COVAX, which has an example of what Paul Farmer pointed to, that a gift is turned into a weapon, that the global solidarity idea behind COVAX and the idea of global collaboration was used to justify as a justification for not expanding vaccine production capabilities in the global south. And together with a colleague, I wrote a paper about this during the pandemic, where we did a close reading of the EU statement against this waiver. And we tried to, what are the hidden assumptions behind this argument? And one of the sentences stated was that there is no indication that intellectual property right issues have been a genuine barrier in relation to COVID-19 related medicines and technologies. So they stated indirectly that the intellectual property rights was not a problem here. So it wouldn't help to lift the waiver or lift the patents, because it wasn't about intellectual property rights, they claimed. The real problem is to be found in the lack of manufacturing capacity in developing countries. And here we are back to the same argument as Paul Farmer criticized in the late 1990s with regards to HIV medication, that the problem was not in the global north, but in the global south, and in their lack of capacity. So put differently, the problem was in their capability of implementing. They lacked the ability to implement. So again, as I explained earlier, unimplementability became a failure that was ascribed to the people on the ground here in the global south. And furthermore, they claimed that measures to tackle current and future supply side shortage must therefore be found outside the intellectual property rights system and include broad and equitable global distribution. So again, the key was distribution, not production. Equity could only be realized through an act of philanthropy, once again. And they took it further because they said that the intellectual property rights system is part of the solution rather than an obstacle, by being one of the main economic incentives to stimulate extraordinary efforts. So again, implicitly, that the that the EPR system was here to protect the interests of manufacturers from the global north. And this is why this is the hidden assumption behind the whole argument of distribution and not production. So I'm going to conclude now by what all this show, in my opinion, is that we really need to rethink the whole concept of implementing the SDGs and sustainability. And we need to, more broadly, we need to think about and rethink how we approach sustainability science also. In my center in Oslo, we don't want to talk about implementation at all. Even if we are set up in order to contribute to the SDGs and to the Sustainable Development Goals, we do not want to do implementation. We want to inspire critical thinking. We want to pluralize the concept of and diversify the concepts and approaches to sustainability. And this is also in line with what Ferreira has described as critical sustainability studies that question a monolithic and top-down understanding of the sustainability agenda, which we have seen being reflected in the SDG implementation framework and in the case of COVAX. Because there are different ways of seeing and knowing sustainability. So it's time to pluralize it in the literature and in the discourse. And critical sustainability studies encourages sustainability scholars and educators and policymakers to move from defined methodology of problem solving or implementation to a more critical moment of calling something into question. And this is the kind of educational agenda that we are working to support in Norway, to inspire future health professionals to think critically about sustainability and health more generally, and to call political projects into question. Thank you so much for your attention.